Hi, everyone, and welcome to God's Plan, Your Part, a podcast where our goal is to read the entire Bible in a year, seeking to understand God's plan of redemption while discovering daily and practically your part in it.
What happens when you totally give up on the truth and just pursue lies over and over and over again? We're going to be looking at that in just a second. Today we are reading Judges 16 to 18. We basically wrap up Samson. We wrap up kind of the Judges narrative of Judges. And then we start to get into sort of the epilogue stories of Judges. And it's getting darker and darker. So maybe like what we should do is let's talk a little bit about Samson, and then let's get into this story about Micah and Levite and a lot of idolatry. What do you think about Samson and Delilah?
He's a dummy. I don't like Samson really at all. I mean, they made a really cool production of the story at Sight and Sound, which I have seen and I like, but it's gross. So he just is like this really prideful guy. He ends up in a really very humbled situation when he's finally overcome by the Philistines. But what I picked up on right away is I guess it's his wife, right?
Yeah, Delilah.
The woman he loved. Did he end up marrying her? I don't even know.
Well, it
doesn't actually say, does it?
It's pretty gray. I mean,
but regardless,
the chapter
Delilah
starts out with a prostitute, then it's Delilah. It's kind of
gross.
Guy's kind of a mess.
Anyway, something that I noticed was they said over and over again, because Samson's not telling her the power or how his strength is stays with him. She says over and over, "Until now you have mocked me." And I think it's just hilarious because she becomes this ridiculous damsel in distress while simultaneously deceiving him. So it's like, oh, you're not telling me the truth, but she's also not telling him the truth either. She wants to know the secret so that she can turn him over for money. So it's just this gross, soap opera, weird situation. I just think all of it is just so disgusting, and there's so much sin and so much deception on every front. So I don't know. I thought that was kind of ironic.
It's interesting. This is Ryan extra credit, I think. I don't know that this is super valuable, but it seems like Samson has an incredible pride problem where he's just maybe it's this. Ooh, maybe it's this. Maybe it's this.
His riddles.
He just doesn't care. And you almost get the idea that he's kind of surprised that God's power left him. The text seems to indicate that the power comes from the fact that he's under this Nazirite vow, and he doesn't care about that vow really at all. But when his head is shaved, that's the final last thread of his Nazirite vow, and then he doesn't have strength.
No pun intended.
Yeah, right. And then he does call out to God for strength, which is interesting because he hasn't really cared about God at all.
Yeah.
And it is, scholars call out that even that is kind of prideful because it seems like it's for revenge and for his own name and not necessarily God's name. But the story, Samson ends with pulling down a building full of Philistines upon himself, and that's it.
Sounds terrible.
And that's the final judge. That's it. This is the last judge. Actually, what you'll notice as we go into 17 is we're used to hearing everybody did what was right in their own eyes, but what we start to hear in 17:6, in those days there was no king in Israel. That's a new addition. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So you get this idea that we're now on this bridge between what's right in their own eyes, but also the fact that there is currently no king. So it's starting to set up that we're going to start heading into Samuel soon.
No king and no judge. He's a judge, but he's not really leading them in any way, shape, or form at this point.
Okay, so moving into 17, it's this whole new narrative that is this guy Micah. He has this deal with his mom. He casts an idol. What's your take on some of this stuff, Jenny?
Well, this is the chapter that I had read, and I was kind of confused as to what was going on at first, but I think that's just kind of, it goes along with the idea of people doing whatever the heck they want to. But it really threw me off at first because his mother finds out that Micah has brought back all this silver And she actually like gives credit to the Lord for, or blessed be my son by the Lord, like asking God to bless him. And it's ridiculous because what they end up doing with the silver has no place for any blessing from the Lord at all whatsoever. Like, you always use the comparison of like idols, right?
Yeah.
With marriage. So like, if you get married and you commit yourself to your husband or wife, no one's going to applaud you for going and cheating on your husband or your wife, whatever the case. So like, just like this, the Lord's not going to be blessing Micah for creating idols and essentially just like making a miniature mock tabernacle in his home. So much so that he's like calling in a sojourner to be his Levitical priest. Like, that is just messed up.
Well, he actually, so at first he has just any old person as his priest. And then he finds a Levite and he's like, oh man, this is cool. And so the original audience would have seen a mess everywhere. Micah should not be making idols. His mom should not be calling on the Lord to bless their idols. A Levite should not be just wandering around selling his Levitical services to just anyone. The tribe of Dan seems like they're being a little bit shady right now.
Just like a lot of really weird, twisted things.
Right. And they make an ephod like Gideon, by the way.
No, and the very last verse of chapter 17 made me like chuckle, like, oh my gosh. It says, then Micah said, now I know that the Lord will prosper me because I have a Levite as a priest. Like, ugh.
So you can tell, I mean, even with Samson, you can tell that we're like to the very extreme edge of faith. But this here is like, wow, complete darkness is sweeping over Israel. The people think they're worshiping the Lord while they're actually worshiping idols. The actual ministers, the pastors, the Levites, they don't have a clue about who God is, but this Levite is like, oh yeah, I can serve you in worshiping these idols. It's a mess. It seems like this Levite is motivated by money, which is terrible. There's just a lot of negative marks on this story. And the original audience would have been like, wow, how far have our people fallen?
Well, it gets even more disgusting, too, because in chapter 18, the Danites, the tribe of Dan, hear about this, and they actually, like, go and steal away that Levite and the idols to worship elsewhere.
Yeah, you're expecting that they're going to fight them.
Yeah, but they actually are just,
not.
like, stealing it from them. So, like, you just see this, like, major just falling out of all things good and wholesome and right in the eyes of the Lord, just traded off for lies, deception, like theft. It's so disgusting.
Just an interesting side note, like the city of Dan is still there. There's a lot of archaeology going on in Dan in Israel, and you can actually see the base of a golden calf idol. It remains there to this day. It's just a base that does have like the places where the idol would have been anchored. But I always like calling out where like modern archaeology actually supports some of these claims, because you get the feel that there actually are people writing these stories and recording what's going on. And so it's obvious if you go to Dan today that there was a lot of idolatry there. But I've been saying this whole time, Judges just spirals downward. And what you see now is they have completely traded their faith in God for something else. They've traded the truth for a lie completely. And it's a mess.
It's funny too. I remember when we were starting Judges, I had mentioned how excited I was because I really appreciate the stories of the Judges. But there are many things left out of my teacher curriculum to third graders that is in this book. And it's funny because our next, like tomorrow, as we're moving beyond the story of everything being stolen, we get into the Levite and his concubine. I remember you saying like, well, it actually ends up with like,
oh, it's terrible,
a priest and a concubine.
Tomorrow's
and
gonna be
like
awful.
Sacrifice and all kinds of crazy stuff. So you can just see how sin is like, it's like a disease. It just creeps in and it starts doing weird stuff and like compromising things for what's comfortable and what is exciting maybe, or easy, and it all just turns to like death and just awful.
So this is interesting in the lens of like there's literally nothing new under the sun. If you flip ahead to the New Testament in Romans 1, Romans 1:21, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images, resembling mortal men and birds and animals and creepy things. Therefore God gave them up to the lust of their hearts, to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creatures rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Like, that's literally what's happening at the end of Judges. It's exactly the same thing. And I think it just goes to show that fallen people continue to be fallen people. It's not a new thing. People who are far from God, they know about God, they could turn to God, they could serve God. When they choose not to. They just keep falling further and further down. And we see that in Judges. So it started out saying, like, what happens when you trade the truth for a lie? You fill your house with idols. You hire a pastor to just tell you what's great. That's literally what's happening. And tomorrow it's going to be real bad. So,
yikes. So how does that turn into a year apart for today?
I think, again, like, it's kind of odd me reading through Judges this time. I continue to think, like, sound doctrine is so radically important. Because you can see they're just going off their feelings. The truth is available to them.
It's almost like they have like a not well-grounded background knowledge of like, well, that kind of sounds like what we're supposed to be doing. Yeah. So, Levites, well, you can see. I'll take you.
Exactly.
Ephod, I'll take you. But then like completely miss the point. Like it literally says, oh, the Lord's going to be so excited with me. But that's like so not true, because everything about the situation is sinful and wrong. And
the Levite is just as confused as Micah. So it's like the apostasy, the absence of faith. It affects Micah. It affects Micah's mother. It affects the Levites, who are supposed to be the representatives of God. So a lack of sound doctrine is radically dangerous because you just start to do things that seem right, but you have no idea what the truth actually is. And so here in Judges, we see the truth has been traded for a lie, and the descent is quickening.
At a rapid pace.
Yeah. So what does that tell us? Like, continue to worship God. Continue to read his word, continue to seek the Lord in prayer. Like, make sure your faith is so sharp and you know what God is revealing. And honestly, it's kind of a shameless plug, but I think reading the entire Bible is so necessary for understanding who God is.
It's changing my view and understanding after literally, I don't know, my family would have started going to church when I was 9. So what is that?
A few years.
A good 20-some years, and I still haven't taken the time to do this. And now that I finally am, it's like, oh my gosh. Like, some of the stuff I feel like I was just like blindly believing, and now it's like, oh my word, this is why I believe this. So it's really, really important so that we don't get to a point where we're just like living out our faith based on how we feel or what we think.
So that's kind of the takeaway. Like, study the word, know who God is, how he's revealed himself in his word, and it will strengthen your faith. I think you will wrestle with your faith, as we have been wrestling with our faith as we're reading through the Bible. There's weird stuff in there. But the more you read it, the more the Holy Spirit reveals to you who God is by the word he's given us. So continue to lean in, and we'll see you again tomorrow. We're finishing out Judges tomorrow, so woohoo.
Wow.
We'll see you then. Hey, thanks so much for listening to our take on God's Word. Stick around and listen to the Word on the second part of the podcast. Before we get in there, we just want to remind you, you can connect with us at any time on social media and YouTube at God's Plan, Your Part. Also, we are a listener-supported podcast, so if you ever want to help us out with the ministry that we're doing, you can do that by clicking the link in our description. And now, here's the reading for today. Judges chapter 16. Samson went to Gaza, and there he saw a prostitute, and he went in to her. There they surrounded the place and set an ambush for him all night at the gate of the city. They kept quiet all night, saying, "Let us wait till the light of morning, then we will kill him." But Samson lay till midnight, and at midnight he arose and took hold of the doors at the gate of the city and the 2 posts, and pulled them up, bar and all, and put them on the shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that was in front of Hebron. After this he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, "Seduce him, and see where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to humble him. And we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver." So Delilah said to Samson, "Please tell me where your great strength lies, and how you might be bound that one could subdue you." Samson said to her, "If you bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." Then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried, and she bound him with them. Now she had men lying in ambush in an inner chamber, and she said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he snapped the bowstrings, as a thread of flax snaps when it touches the fire. So the secret of his strength was not known. Then Delilah said to Samson, "Behold, you have mocked me and told me lies. Please tell me how you might be bound." And he said to her, "If they bind me with new ropes that have not been used, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." So Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And the men lying in ambush were in an inner chamber, but he snapped the ropes off his arms like a thread. Then Delilah said to Samson, "Until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me how you might be bound." And he said to her, "If you weave the 7 locks of my head with the web and fasten it tight with the pin, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." So while he slept, Delilah took the 7 locks on his head and wove them into a web. And she made them tight with the pin and said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he awoke from his sleep and pulled away the pin, the loom, and the web. And she said to him, "How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times, and you have not told me where your great strength lies." And when she pressed him hard with her words day after day, and urged him, his soul was vexed to death. And he told her all his heart, and said to her, "A razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man." When Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, "Come up again, for he has told me all his heart." Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hands. So she made him sleep on her knees, and she called a man and had him shave off the 7 locks off his head. Then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. And she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And he awoke from his sleep and said, "I will go out as at other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. And the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles. And he ground at the mill in the prison. But the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Now the lords of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon their god, and rejoice. And they said, "Our God has given Samson our enemy into our hand." And when the people saw him, they praised their God. For they said, "Our God has given our enemy into our hand, the ravager of our country, who has killed many of us." And when their hearts were merry, they said, "Call Samson, that he may entertain us." So they called Samson out of the prison, and he entertained them. They made him stand between the pillars. And Samson said to the young man who held him by the hand, "Let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, that I may lean against them." Now the house was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there. And on the roof there were about 3,000 men and women who looked on while Samson entertained. Then Samson called to the Lord and said, "O Lord God, please remember me, and please strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." And Samson grasped the 2 metal pillars which the house rested, and he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he bowed with all his strength, and the house fell upon the lords and upon the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at the death were more than those whom he had killed during his life. Then his brothers and all his family came down and took him, and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol, on the tomb of Manoah his father. He had judged Israel 20 years.
There was a man of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Micah. And he said to his mother, the 1,100 pieces of silver that were taken from you, about which you uttered a curse, and also spoke it in my ears, behold, the silver is with me. I took it. And his mother said, Blessed be my son by the Lord. And he restored the 1,100 pieces of silver to his mother. And his mother said, I dedicate this silver to the Lord from my hand for my son, to make a carved image and a metal image. Now therefore I will restore it to you. So when he restored the money to his mother took 200 pieces of silver and gave it to the silversmith, who made it into a carved image and a metal image. And it was in the house of Micah. And the man Micah had a shrine, and he made an ephod and household gods, and ordained one of his sons who became his priest. And in those days there was no king of Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Now there was a young man of Bethlehem in Judah, of the family of Judah, who was a Levite, and he had sojourned there. And the man departed from the town of Bethlehem in Judah to sojourn where he could find a place. And as he journeyed, he came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Micah. And Micah said to him, Where do you come from? And he said to him, I am a Levite of Bethlehem in Judah, and I am going to sojourn where I may find a place. And Micah said to him, Stay with me, to be me a father and a priest, and I will give you 10 pieces of silver a year, and a suit of clothes, and your living. And the Levite went in. And the Levite was content to dwell with the man, and the young man became to him like one of his sons. And Micah ordained the Levite, and the young man became his priest, and was in the house of Micah. Then Micah said, Now I know that the Lord will prosper me, because I have a Levite as priest.
In those days there was no king in Israel, and in those days the tribe of the people of Dan was seeking for itself an inheritance to dwell in, for until then no inheritance among the tribes of Israel had fallen to them. So the people of Dan sent 5 able men from the whole number of their tribe, from Zorah and from Eshtaol, to spy out the land and explore it. And they said to them, Go and explore the land. And they came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, and lodged there. When they were there by the house of Micah, they recognized the voice of the young Levite. And they turned aside and said to him, Who brought you here? What are you doing in this place? What is your business here? And he said to them, This is how Micah dealt with me. He has hired me, and I have become his priest. And they said to him, Inquire of God, please, that we may know whether the journey on which we are setting out will succeed. And the priest said to them, Go in peace. The journey on which you go is under the eye of the Lord. Then the 5 men departed and came to Laish, and saw the people who were there, how they lived in security after the manner of the Sidonians, quiet and unsuspecting, lacking nothing that is in the earth and possessing wealth, and how they were far from the Sidonians, and had no dealings with anyone. And when they came to their brothers at Zorah and Eshtaol, their brothers said to them, What do you report? They said, Arise, and let us go up against them, for we have seen the land, and behold, it is very good. And will you do nothing? Do not be slow to go, to enter in and possess the land. As soon as you go, you will come to an unsuspecting people. The land is spacious, for God has given it into your hands, a place where there is no lack of anything that is in the earth. So 600 men of the tribe of Dan, armed with weapons of war, set out from Zorah and Eshtaol, and went up and encamped in Kiriath-Jearim in Judah. On this account, that place is called Manah Dan to this day. Behold, it is west of Kiriath-Jearim. And they passed on from there to the hill country at Ephraim, and came to the house of Micah. Then the 5 men who had gone to scout out the country of Laish said to their brothers, Do you know that in these houses there are an ephod, household gods, a carved image, and a metal image? Now therefore consider what you will do. And they turned aside there, and came to the house of the young Levite at the home of Micah, and asked him about his welfare. Now the 600 men of the Danites, armed with their weapons of war, stood by the entrance of the gate. And the 5 men who had gone to scout out the land went up and entered in, and took the carved image, the ephod, the household gods, and the metal image, while the priest stood by the entrance of the gate with 600 men armed with weapons of war. And when these went into Micah's house and took the carved image, the ephod, and the household gods, and the metal image, the priest said to them, What are you doing? And they said to him, Keep quiet, put your hand on your mouth, and come with us, and be to us a father and a priest. Is it better for you to be a priest to the house of one man, or to be a priest to a tribe and a clan in Israel?" And the priest's heart was glad. He took the ephod and the household gods and the carved image and went along with the people. So they turned and departed, putting the little ones and the livestock and the goods in front of them. When they had gone a distance from the home of Micah, the men who were in the house near Micah's house were called out, and they overtook the people of Dan. And they shouted to the people of Dan, who turned around and said to Micah, "What is the matter with you, that you came out with such a company?" And he said, "You take my gods that I made, and the priest, and you go away. And what have I left? How then do you ask me, what is the matter with you?" And the people of Dan said to him, "Do not let your voice be heard among us, lest angry fellows fall upon you, and you lose your life with the lives of your household." Then the people of Dan went their way. And when Micah saw that they were too strong for him, he turned and went back to his home. But the people of Dan took what Micah had made, and the priest who belonged to him, and they came to Laish, to a people quiet and unsuspecting, and struck them with the edge of the sword and burned the city with fire. And there was no deliverer, because it was far from Sidon, and they had no dealings with anyone. It was in the valley that belongs to Beth Rehob, and they rebuilt the city and lived in it. And they named the city Dan, after the name of Dan their ancestor, who was born to Israel. But the name of the city was Laish at the first. And the people of Dan set up the carved image for themselves, and Jonathan the son of Gershom, the son of Moses, and his sons, were priests of the tribe of the Danites, until the day of the captivity in the land. So they set up Micah's carved image that he had made, as long as the house of God was at Shiloh.
Thanks so much for listening to God's Plan, Your Part. If anything stuck out to you, if you have any questions, or if you'd like to receive a Bible, you can email us at godsplанyourpart@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the podcast, please consider supporting us through the link in our description. We love that you're on this journey with us, and we hope you have a great day. See you tomorrow.